Take it away, Nick.
All right, let me just share out my screen. Okay, cool. Why have I lost Zoom? Let me see, just check. Okay. So, thank you for participating all the way through to this evening, or to this session. As Bron mentioned, I'm going to be talking about sort of the future of sort of the Windows platform. This is actually based on an article I did recently for infoq magazine, so hopefully you can take it and read it at your leisure. But the core gist of this is that Microsoft's been putting a lot of work into basically trying to reunify the Windows developer ecosystem. So in this session, we're going to talk about, I guess, what I consider to be the future. This is something that we continue to badger Microsoft about in terms of trying to provide a clear vision for developers. But the reality is that the story isn't as clean as Microsoft or anybody would like it to be. There's been a few missteps dating all the way back to the sort of the Windows 8 era. And hopefully we'll be able to sort of move forward in a sort of fairly cohesive manner as we move into it. At the end of the session, if we have time, I'll also talk about how this plays into sort of the two options that I see for cross-platform developers in the sort of the .NET ecosystem. So let's jump into it and talk about where we currently are with the Windows sort of ecosystem. For those who've been around for a while, like myself, you'll remember all the way back to doing Windows Forms and WPF development. But things kind of changed as we started to move into sort of the Windows Phone era. So with Windows Phone, they basically took a lot of the learnings of Silverlight and building things that are sort of relatively constrained and have this sort of sandbox feel to it. And as part of Windows Phone and Windows 8, they sort of developed this model where you could build apps that were going to be published into the store, and essentially they ran in this sort of sandboxed environment. And sort of developers who were fairly new to it sort of latched on and started building phone and Windows apps. But those developers who were sort of Windows Forms and WPF developers were somewhat frustrated by this fairly closed environment that they were now being told to work in. And this sort of progressed a little bit as we walked into sort of the Windows 10 era. We started building sort of UWP or Universal Windows Platform-based applications. But the reality is that that sandbox was still there. And there was this sort of fragmentation going on between full framework developers that were sort of your Windows Form and WPF developers, and this sort of new breed of what Microsoft would like to see the future of the Windows platform being, which was sort of UWP at the time. Now, the problem with that is that UWP suffered somewhat, not only because some of the limitations or constraints that the sandbox environment put on it, but also suffered from the fact that every time Microsoft wanted to ship new APIs, they'd essentially be constrained by the version of Windows itself. So every time they shipped a new platform version, there was a new SDK version, and UWP developers got a new raft of APIs. And so there was a lot of pushback that basically says, well, these APIs, as much as we like them, don't benefit us because we need to support older versions of Windows. And particularly in the enterprise space where, you know, the enterprise was still trying to get everybody onto Windows 10, let alone the latest version of Windows 10. So Microsoft basically sort of did a bit of a rethink of this and said, well, what happens if we could sort of take the XAML framework that was part of UWP, which developers on the whole generally like. They like the clean version of XAML. They like the fact that they could, you know, there's a separation between design and the code logic for their applications. What happens if we could extract that and sort of keep it away from the versions of the operating system? And so this is where Windows UI or WinUI came about. Now, it's actually sort of Microsoft have been shipping controls for UWP out of band of the OS for a while, sort of as a separate library. And so what they did is they sort of amalgamated that with this new brand that they wanted to build up that basically separated the XAML platform from the Windows OS. And so this Windows UI sort of brand came about. And there's a little bit of confusion here because there is sort of two versions of it. There's a 2.x version, and that's designed for working within a UWP application. So it is still bound to those OS releases, but it has the latest controls and it has the controls that Microsoft are working on and iterating on for use in UWP. The new version of WinUI, or WinUI 3, is one that is this new separated XAML framework. And the idea there is that you can start to build an application that is separated from the underlying platform. Now, along the way, they've sort of discovered that, well, if we can separate it away from the OS, why do we need to stay in the app container? And so, you know, whilst their original thinking was really to support UWP developers and try to build in a way that you didn't need to be locked into particular OS versions, it quite quickly became this thing that was larger than just WinUI. It was larger than just the XAML framework. And this is where Project Reunion, that was announced at Build 2020, I think, came about. And the idea there is that Project Reunion, as it was then called, would be this overarching framework that any Windows developer could make use of. So it didn't matter whether you're a WinUI developer or a Windows Forms or a Windows or WPF developer or even a UWP developer. The theory was that you could take advantage of Project Reunion. So you'd be able to take advantage of the latest controls that were encapsulated in WinUI, but you would also get other services and other capabilities that would go along with it. So some of the packaging benefits that you'd get with a UWP project, you could potentially get for a Windows Forms or a WPF application. Now, a lot of those capabilities you could wrap yourself and you could deliver yourself. For example, you could wrap your WinForms application using an MSIX package, and you could distribute it via the store. But it wasn't very seamless. It wasn't as easy as just a one-click thing in Visual Studio or in your CI/CD pipeline to actually generate that package. And similarly, things like enrolling in identity so that you can actually make use of things like push notifications. They were non-trivial tasks. You could do them, but they were non-trivial. And so the idea there is that there are a lot of nice things that were built into the UWP framework or package or application framework that could then be extracted and made a lot easier for existing developers. And so this roadmap came about that was originally focused around WinUI, and then they started looking at shipping things with the Project Reunion banner. And so far we've seen sort of two major iterations of this Project Reunion. We've seen 0.5 released earlier this year, and really recently we've seen 0.8 released. Along with the 0.8 release, they actually rebranded Project Reunion. Project Reunion was never designed to be their ship name. It was a good marketing thing at the time because it was designed to reunify sort of WinForms WPF developers and provide them with the similar sort of capabilities of UWP. But it was never designed to be their ship vehicle or the ship targeting branding, because whilst existing developers can make sense of it, it was more of an internal name. It didn't really make sense to your average developer. So they settled on the Windows App SDK. And so there's been a bit of noise recently around Windows 11 and sort of the consumer part of where that's going. But alongside that, they did a parallel announcement for developers that was the Windows App SDK. And so 0.8 of that has just shipped. It is stable. It is available for you to build and release your applications with a version 1 scheduled for later this year. What does this bring us? Well, actually, for an existing UWP developer, it doesn't actually bring anything. If you have a UWP application and you're shipping on UWP and you're perhaps making use of the WinUI 2x controls and some of those features, you don't gain anything by taking a dependency on the Win App SDK. And in fact, for UWP developers, the only way you can take a dependency is actually using the preview of those. So Microsoft has not announced, and you know their recent indications will be that UWP developers will not get access directly to the Win App SDK. So the question then becomes, okay, well, what's the future of UWP and UWP developers? Well, right now, you've got a couple of options. Microsoft has committed to new versions of the WinUI 2x framework or controls and control library. And so one of the options is that you stay with UWP and you continue to ship your app on UWP. And that's a perfectly valid strategy. And it will continue to be supported and maintained. And you'll be able to support all of the desktop environments and Surface Hub and HoloLens and Xbox that you would previously. The other path is that you start to look at a migration across to a Windows App SDK application. And by that, I mean, essentially, it would be a UWP or a WinUI 3 on desktop. So essentially, it's a Win32 based application. And the nice thing here is that that translation can actually be done quite, or transition, I should say, can be done quite easily across from UWP across to a WinUI 3 desktop applications. Now, there are currently some things that will not translate properly. So a lot of things around core window and core applications, so things like the lifecycle management and stuff like that, those aren't there yet. And so there is no transition path for those parts yet. But the core of your XAML logic should transition very nicely with some minor namespace changes. And so the migration across to a WinUI desktop application is the second option that UWP applications have right now. Okay, so let's step away from UWP for 1 second and let's address sort of the Windows Forms and the WPF-based development. Now, right now, you can take a dependency on the Windows App SDK from either a Windows Form or a WPF application. But you might be asking, okay, well, what does this give me? And right now, the answer is it gives you a couple of little things. Like, for example, you can make use of the sort of the nice resource management and the resource loading that UWP developers have had. So, for example, if you wanted to ship different resources based on language or based on screen resolution, you can actually take advantage of those things using the same sort of resource management capabilities that UWP developers have had. You can also start to make use of some of the things like identity and some of the things like that Microsoft's working around in terms of windowing and those types of things. Those will be, you can take advantage of those from your application. But the core thing that would be really nice to have in Windows Forms or WPF is actually access to the WinUI capabilities. And so that's the nice rounded corners and the nice, the theming and stuff like that that's coming in WinUI. Those things are due to come. They're not as easy as just bolting them on right now. There's a technology called XAML Islands that Microsoft has committed to, and it's down on the feature list. But right now, we're not sure whether that's going to ship in V1 or beyond V1. And so that's the technology that's really interesting for an existing Windows Form or existing WPF-based application, because you can start to create new windows using WinUI, or you can actually embed existing, new WinUI controls actually into your existing WinForms or WPF-based application. And so you can start to light up a lot of features within your application. I think everyone sort of come to the conclusion that existing WinForms applications or WPF applications are not going to immediately jump over to being a entirely WinUI 3 based application. In the same way as they didn't migrate to UWP. But the reality is that you will be able to make use of a number of those components from the WinUI 3 library within your existing application. So if we look further on down the track, the vision for this Windows App SDK is that every developer that's targeting Windows, whether you're a Windows Form or WPF developer, should be able to take advantage of the SDK. Now, the caveat there is that we don't actually know what the future of UWP is going to be. Microsoft has committed to there being, it to be supported and it to be a platform that will be available going forward. But whether they'll start to benefit from the Windows App SDK, we don't know right now. There's definitely a clear migration path that Microsoft's talked about. In fact, they gave an example of that at the Windows 11 developer event. They showed how an existing UWP application could easily be migrated and start to take advantage of some of the capabilities of the Windows App SDK. Sorry, my slides have talked ahead of my slides. So these are some of the core benefits that Microsoft has talked about as part of the Windows App SDK. So they're looking for a way for all applications to become a much more coherent, using modern interaction and UX design. So a lot of those sort of the design features that are coming into Windows 11, rounded corners, the semi-transparent background, so the micro background, all of those will come to the Windows App SDK. It's also been tailored to take advantage of device hardware and performance and battery life. What's really interesting about some of these, the first 2 or 3 points here is that those are all some of the same advantages that Microsoft talked about when they were talking about how great UWP would be. And so what they're really talking about here is taking some of those advantages and some of those benefits that UWP has actually had for so long and retrofitting and bringing those back to Win32 based applications. And then I guess the last point is about that unification, and the idea there is that, you know, going forward, when Microsoft is iterating new features and you know, they've got a common way to enable it for every platform that is really or any framework that is really targeting Windows. Okay, if we look down at break down as to what features are shipping, you'll see that we're now somewhere between the 8 SDK, the 0.8 version and the 1.0 in terms of what their development effort is going into. One thing that's really interesting here is the talking about packaged versus unpackaged applications, and this is particularly relevant when you start to look at, you know, Windows Forms or WPF applications that for so long have been used to be able to sort of do X-copy deployment. So you can literally zip up you know, your built application, copy it to a new machine, unzip it, and off you go. You're good to run. Now, that's always assuming that you've got the .NET framework installed. But if you've migrated to .NET 5, you can actually ship the entire thing as a self-contained zip file, right? So you can ship it to a new desktop, unzip it, and off you go. You're good to go. That's one thing that's not currently available for UWP developers, but one thing that they're trying to enable as part of the Windows App SDK is the idea that any application, so WinForms, WPF, WinUI 3 for desktop, any of those applications should be able to be distributed in an unpackaged format. And so, you know, that's the second group of feature sets. Okay, so you can see here that it's lagging somewhat behind the packaged version. A lot of the features that are coming in the packaged world are made easier by the fact that, you know, there's an MSIAX package, which brings along with it things like identity, and it brings along with the ability to register for certain capabilities and that type of thing. So those things that they're trying to disconnect away from the packaging capability, but it's difficult because there are things that are bolted into the OS that they need to take into consideration. So, you know, the way applications get identity is actually an OS feature. And so they need to actually work out how they can extract it in a way that, you know, can be packaged or can be included in an unpackaged application. Again, these are all things that you could have actually done in a Windows Form or a WPF application, but you'd need to know which registry hacks to apply as part of installing or part of setting up your application. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about this move to Windows UI and one of the opportunities that it actually opens up, particularly for existing applications, is the ability to go cross-platform. There's actually two technologies I'll talk about in this section. So one is called the UNO platform. And this comes out of a long heritage in building for Windows, so building UWP and sort of the Windows 8 applications that came before it. And actually leverages the same XAML that is available in UWP and WinUI. And then the other technology is .NET MAUI. So this is formerly called Xamarin Forms, and essentially it has its own style of XAML to define layout. And so Xamarin Forms has been available for building iOS and Android and Windows apps for quite some time. What's significant about .NET MAUI is that they are thinking the way the underlying architecture works. They realize that they can do a better job of moving, if they move away from the old renderer model into a new model that uses these things called handlers. Now, we're not going to go deep dive into these, but I do want to point out that one of the big differences between UNO and the direction that .NET MAUI is going is that their XAML is different, and the understanding or the way that they apply XAML is different. And so one of the reasons I tend to prefer UNO is that it's closely related to the way that UWP and Windows UI works. Is that you know, your controls are templated, you can drive you can style things without actually having to drop down to the underlying controls. UNO, one thing people don't realize about UNO is it does still make use of the underlying platform controls. So, you know, for example, when you're using a text control, it still relies on the underlying platform control for text, which means that it gets all of the benefits for accessibility and those types of things. And one of the interesting things here in terms of, if we look at the Windows platform, why this is relevant to WinForms and WPF applications is as they start to take advantage of the Windows App SDK and start to add components that are based on WinUI into their applications, those components can actually be leveraged to go cross-platform by using the Uno platform. And so you can actually take those components, the ones that you have rebuilt for WinUI. So it may be that you add specific screens to your Windows Form or your WPF applications that are driven or that are created using Windows UI, and those can then be taken across platform to Uno. So before we get further on, that's actually the end of the slides, but what I wanted to do is quickly just drop in and actually show you essentially a brand new WinUI project. Essentially, when you create a project today, based on the WinUI template, or when you go through the steps in Visual Studio, it's still referred to as WinUI. I'd imagine at some stage that'll get uplifted to the Windows App SDK, and so you'll be building a Windows App SDK application. It looks fairly similar to, if we ignore this packaging project, it looks fairly similar to the way a new UWP application creates. In fact, it's not too dissimilar to a new WPF application. What is different currently is this need to have this separate packaging project. If you've ever worked with, say, or tried to take a Win32 application and deliver it to the Microsoft Store, you'll be familiar with this packaging application. The idea there is that you can drop in a packaging application to an existing app, so based on Windows Forms or WPF, and create the association between those. So you basically add the app as a dependency for the packaging project. And what it will do is when you've built your application, the packaging project will then take everything that's built and wrap it in this MSIX that you can then deliver to the store. So essentially this is the same model for that. And you can see that it's got this manifest file that goes with it. If we take a look at the code in here, you can actually see that it's got things like an identity for your application. And so that's important because, the identity of the application is relevant for both how it runs in the sandbox or the container, but also how it will actually register for things like push notifications. So the long-term plan is for this packaging project to go away, at least for Windows UI applications. So that's going to be essentially merged in with this application. So hopefully by version 1, when you go to create a brand new WinUI application, you'll only get this top application that's got your application and the first window of your application. So if we open one of these files, you'd see that the XAML is fairly familiar for anybody who's worked with XAML. So it's defining things like your stack layouts and your buttons and stuff like that. So I don't want to particularly delve into the details of XAML or any of the details of the framework at this point. I guess it is fairly new territory for a lot of people, and particularly even if you're an existing Windows developer, the Windows App SDK might actually be quite new, and I do sort of encourage everyone to sort of go and have a look. So with that, I will just on to the last one, which is opening the floor to questions.